A single airport photo can turn into a financial audit when your entire career has been built on looking untouchable. That is the strange position Rick Ross found himself in after he was seen traveling on a commercial flight. For most people, this would not even qualify as a story. It would be a seat assignment, a carry-on bag, a delayed boarding group, and then life moves on. But Rick Ross is not most people. For nearly 2 decades, Rick Ross has sold a world of Maybachs, mansion gates, giant watches, private aviation, executive talk, and a voice so commanding that even a grocery list could sound like a corporate takeover. So when Rick Ross appeared in an airport like everybody else, the internet did what the internet does best. It did not ask whether flying commercial is normal. It asked whether the image had finally become too expensive to maintain. And that question is bigger than one flight. Because the real issue is not whether Rick Ross can afford a ticket. The real issue is whether the mythology around Rick Ross has entered a phase where every ordinary decision gets read as evidence of a collapse. A hoodie becomes a disguise. A commercial flight becomes a bankruptcy filing. A ticket promotion becomes proof that an entire career is over. That is how celebrity perception works once the public decides it has found a crack in the glass. Rick Ross responded to the speculation by saying his private jet was being upgraded with Starlink internet and that flying commercial was a choice made while the aircraft was unavailable. That explanation may be enough for some people. For others, the explanation became part of the joke. And that reaction tells us something important. This is no longer only a money conversation. This is a credibility conversation. Before we decide what that means, we have to separate the facts from the performance, the jokes from the records, and the real Rick Ross from the version of Rick Ross that has lived in rap culture for years. Because there are really 2 stories happening at once. The first is about a rapper who built one of the most recognizable brands in modern hip-hop. The second is about an audience that has become trained to challenge every luxury claim the second it stops looking flawless. Rick Ross did not become famous by being modest. From the beginning, the brand was scale. Bigger cars, bigger homes, bigger records, bigger declarations. Even the name Rick Ross arrived carrying weight before the music did. The name echoed Freeway Rick Ross, a figure whose own life story had already become part of American drug war mythology. That overlap eventually led to a legal dispute, but it also illustrates the core of the Ross brand. Every detail was built to feel larger than a normal biography. Then came Hustlin'. The record did more than introduce a rapper. It introduced a character. Rick Ross spoke like a man who had already won, and hip-hop has always responded to conviction. Listeners do not only buy lyrics, they buy atmosphere. Rick Ross understood that a rap star can become an environment. The beat, the ad-libs, the visual language, the luxury references, the beard, the sunglasses, the slow delivery, everything served the same message. This is the boss. And once you create a character that powerful, the public starts measuring every real-life moment against the character's promise. That is why the commercial flight discussion exploded. It was not because anyone seriously believes a commercial flight is shameful. It was because Rick Ross had spent years turning private travel into a symbol. In the mythology, the boss does not wait at the gate. The boss is not scanning a boarding pass. The boss is not dealing with a middle seat. The boss arrives in a machine that looks like a rolling headquarters. But real wealth is not a costume that has to be worn every minute. Wealth can mean choosing convenience. Wealth can mean avoiding the operating costs of an aircraft while it is being serviced. Wealth can mean not treating commercial travel like a personal defeat. The problem for Rick Ross is that his public image leaves very little room for normality. When your brand is permanent elevation, even a practical decision can look like a descent. And the online reaction did not happen in a vacuum. Rick Ross is walking into this moment with years of unresolved questions attached to his public identity. Some of those questions are old. Some are tied to business. Some are tied to competition. And some were pushed back into the spotlight because of his public conflict with Drake. The Drake situation matters because it changed the temperature around Rick Ross. For years, Rick Ross and Drake were one of rap's most dependable combinations. Their records sounded expensive before the first verse arrived. Aston Martin music, Stay Schemin', Lord Knows, Lemon Pepper Freestyle, and Money in the Grave all helped create an expectation. If Rick Ross and Drake were on the same track, there would be polish, cinematic weight, and a certain kind of luxury rap chemistry. That history made their 2024 split feel heavier than a routine exchange of insults. This was not two artists who had never worked together. This was a partnership the audience had watched succeed for more than a decade. When Future and Metro Boomin released We Don't Trust You, Rick Ross appeared on Everyday Hustle. That alone did not prove a feud. But the context was loud. Kendrick Lamar's verse on the album had set off a chain reaction across hip-hop, and every alliance suddenly mattered. Rick Ross later shared support around the moment, unfollowed Drake, and soon found himself directly addressed on Drake's push-ups. Drake's angle was simple: question Rick Ross's standing, question the origins of some of his biggest chart moments, and remind the public that several major records in Ross's streaming history involved Drake. Rick Ross answered quickly with champagne moments. The response was personal, aggressive, and designed to make the split impossible to ignore. What changed after that was not merely the relationship between Drake and Rick Ross. What changed was the audience's willingness to interrogate the Ross persona all over again. Every time a celebrity feud gets big enough, old narratives return with new energy. The public reopens files it had already read. It revisits interviews. It compares statements. It looks for contradictions. And the internet's favorite kind of contradiction is the one between a star's self-description and a piece of paperwork. For Rick Ross, the corrections officer conversation has been one of those permanent files. Reports and public discussion about his past employment circulated years ago, and the subject has repeatedly returned during conflicts. In a 2022 interview, Rick Ross described a brief period around age 20 in which he said he did not last long. Later reporting discussed documents said to show employment dates from late 1995 to mid-1997, as well as a recognition for attendance. That difference between a casual recollection and documents discussed online became fuel for critics. But here is where the story often gets distorted. Working as a corrections officer does not erase a person's music career. It does not automatically prove that every lyric is false. It does not make an artist incapable of creating a persona. What it does show is that Rick Ross's path to rap fame was more complicated than the early mythology suggested. And complicated biographies are not rare in entertainment. The difference is that Rick Ross built a brand so absolute that any complication became a headline. That is the trap of a larger-than-life image. The audience may forgive imperfection. It may even admire it. But only after the artist has made space for it. Rick Ross built his empire through certainty. Therefore, every uncertainty gets magnified. Now add business to the equation. There is a version of this story online that says a commercial flight proves Rick Ross is broke. That is not supported by the public facts available. Rick Ross has had a long recording career, owns or has been publicly associated with multiple business ventures, has spoken often about franchising and real estate, and has maintained a highly visible catalog and touring presence. A viral image does not give the public access to an artist's balance sheet. It gives the public one image. One image can still be powerful. A photo of Rick Ross boarding a commercial flight is powerful because it clashes with the expected picture. But a clash is not a conclusion. It is content. And in the current attention economy, content does not need to be true before it becomes contagious. It only needs to be easy to understand in half a second. This is where the boss image becomes both an advantage and a burden. Rick Ross has always understood visual storytelling. Think about the way he talks about his home, his cars, his jet, his ranch, his business meetings, his breakfast rituals, his lawn equipment. Even the famous clips of Rick Ross cutting grass at his huge Georgia property do not play like ordinary chores. They play like scenes from a Rick Ross universe. The tractor is not just a tractor. It is an extension of the brand. A normal person mowing a lawn is doing maintenance. Rick Ross mowing a lawn becomes a display of control over acreage, time, and lifestyle. That is why people watch the airport clip differently. The same audience that can accept a man cutting his own grass on hundreds of acres still expects a different visual code from air travel. A commercial flight interrupts the fantasy more sharply than a lawnmower ever could. And then there is the timing. Rick Ross is marking 2 decades since Port of Miami, the album that positioned him as a major force in rap. The 20th anniversary events are built around legacy, a reminder of where the image started and how long it has lasted. Official event pages list orchestra-backed performances connected to that anniversary. That is not the profile of an artist disappearing from the conversation. It is the profile of an artist converting catalog history into a live experience. But legacy tours create another kind of scrutiny. Every seating chart becomes a scorecard. Every promotional offer becomes a verdict. Every video of an empty section travels farther than a clip of a packed room. This is unfair in one sense, because ticket pricing, venue configuration, local demand, and marketing strategy are all more complicated than one screenshot. Yet it is completely predictable in another sense, because hip-hop has always treated visibility as evidence of status. If the seats look full, the brand is winning. If a deal appears online, the brand is being questioned. If a private jet is seen, the brand is thriving. If a commercial flight is seen, the brand is under investigation. That is not finance. That is theater. And Rick Ross is a master of theater. The reason this moment is so interesting is that he may now be facing the downside of the rules he helped establish. In a genre where aspiration is currency, he spent years setting the exchange rate. The bigger the promise, the bigger the reaction when reality looks ordinary. There is also a generational shift happening. The old version of celebrity depended on distance. The public saw the album cover, the interview, the music video, the concert. The artist controlled the frame. The new version of celebrity is constant surveillance. A phone can turn a grocery run, an airport walk, a dinner, a hotel lobby, or a bad angle into a public referendum. No artist can fully control that environment. But artists whose brands rely on invincibility are especially vulnerable to it. Rick Ross is not being judged against the average person. He is being judged against Rick Ross. That distinction matters. The person stepping onto a commercial flight may be making a rational choice. The character called the biggest boss is being tested by an audience that has been taught to expect excess. And because audiences now participate in the narrative through memes, reaction videos, quote tweets, and comment sections, the artist no longer gets to decide alone what a moment means. The public writes the sequel in real time. Drake understood that when the feud intensified. Much of the power in a diss record is not the diss itself, it is the frame it gives fans to repeat. A punchline becomes a tag. A tag becomes a comment. A comment becomes a lens through which people view unrelated events. Once that happens, the target is no longer responding to one song. The target is responding to a crowd that has adopted a storyline. Rick Ross has used exactly that kind of framing against opponents throughout his career. He knows how a single phrase can become a label. He knows how a joke can stick. He knows how repetition can turn a claim into a running narrative. That is why the current moment is not simple humiliation or simple vindication. It is a battle over who gets to define the image next. Is Rick Ross an aging star facing the limits of a luxury persona? Is he a successful businessman taking a normal flight while his aircraft is upgraded? Is he being unfairly judged by a culture that demands spectacle from artists forever? Or is the truth some combination of all three? The honest answer is that no airport photograph can settle those questions. What it can reveal is how fragile perception can be when an artist has made perception part of the product. Look at the contradiction at the center of Rick Ross's story. His greatest strength has always been that he can make abundance feel believable. Even listeners who do not know every detail of his business life understand the sound of a Rick Ross record. It feels like leather seats, city lights, late-night calls, champagne, ocean views, and serious conversations behind tinted glass. That atmosphere is a creative accomplishment. It is why Rick Ross's music has lasted beyond individual controversies. But the same atmosphere can make a commercial boarding gate look like a plot twist. And that is the real cost of branding yourself as a permanent symbol instead of a person. Symbols are not allowed to have mundane days. Symbols do not get mechanical delays. Symbols do not adjust travel plans. Symbols do not explain Wi-Fi installations. The second they do, the audience asks whether the statue is hollow. Rick Ross has seen versions of this scrutiny before. The name controversy, the corrections officer story, the 50-cent rivalry, questions about lifestyle, debates over lyrics, arguments over authenticity. Each time, Rick Ross survived partly because the music was strong enough and partly because his confidence was stronger than the criticism. That is why it is premature to call this a downfall. A downfall requires more than jokes. It requires evidence of a real loss of relevance, a real collapse of creative power, or a real inability to move an audience. Rick Ross still has a deep catalog, a recognizable name, major collaborations, an anniversary campaign, and a brand that people care enough to debate. You do not become irrelevant when people argue over every move. You become irrelevant when nobody notices the move at all. Still, attention is not always admiration. There is a danger when an artist's name becomes easier to attach to a meme than to a new musical moment. There is a danger when every response sounds defensive, even when the explanation is reasonable. And there is a danger when old rivalries have trained the public to interpret every headline through a hostile frame. That is the strategic challenge in front of Rick Ross. Not proving that he can buy luxury. He has spent years doing that. Not winning every comment section. Nobody can. The real challenge is deciding whether the next chapter of the Rick Ross brand needs more transparency, more music, more humor, or a new kind of confidence. Maybe the smartest response is not to fight every joke. Maybe it is to make the next record impossible to ignore. Maybe it is to let the Port of Miami anniversary remind people why the Ross persona became powerful in the first place. Maybe it is to own the contradiction. Yes, a man can have a private jet and still fly commercial. Yes, an artist can have a complicated past and still build an enduring career. Yes, a luxury rapper can be both a real businessman and a public character. Or maybe the public will not accept nuance because nuance is not as entertaining as a downfall story. That is the uncomfortable truth behind this entire debate. The internet does not usually reward the most accurate explanation. It rewards the cleanest narrative. Rick Ross flew commercial because his jet was undergoing an upgrade is a detail. The boss got caught at the airport is a story. One is more responsible. The other is easier to share. And easy-to-share stories can become more influential than facts. So, when people ask whether Rick Ross is broke, the better question is this: what evidence are they actually using? A commercial flight? A ticket screenshot? A feud quote? A meme? None of those things reveals the full financial reality of a person with a long career and private business interests. But when people ask whether Rick Ross's image has taken a hit, that is a different question. The answer is probably yes, at least temporarily. The airport moment gave critics a visual they can reuse. The Drake conflict gave them a storyline. Old controversies gave them a back catalog of accusations. And social media gave them an arena where every detail can be replayed until it feels larger than the event itself. That does not mean the boss is finished. It means the boss is in a different kind of battle. Not a battle for a chart position. Not a battle over who has the better punchline. A battle over whether the audience still wants the original fantasy exactly as it was, or whether it now expects the man behind the fantasy to explain himself every time reality appears on camera. For Rick Ross, that might be the most revealing part of this moment. He has always been skilled at turning pressure into content. He has always known how to turn a conversation into an event. The question is whether he can turn this one into a reset. Because the private jet may return from its upgrade. The commercial flight jokes will eventually fade. A new feud, a new viral clip, or a new album will take over the timeline. But the underlying lesson will remain. In modern rap, image is not decoration. It is a contract with the audience. Rick Ross signed that contract years ago with every Maybach reference, every mansion video, every private jet clip, every declaration of boss status. The audience signed it too, because they wanted to believe in the world he was building. Now the audience is asking for an audit. Not necessarily because Rick Ross is broke, but because the bigger the image, the louder the questions become when it looks human. And maybe that is the final irony. Flying commercial is ordinary. It is responsible. It is normal. But for a rapper who's spent years making extraordinary look effortless, normal can become the most controversial thing in the world. What do you think? Did the airport clip expose a serious problem, or did social media turn a practical travel decision into a bigger story than it deserved? And beyond Rick Ross, should rap fans stop treating every luxury image as literal proof of an artist's finances, or is that exactly the bargain celebrities make when they build their careers on spectacle? There is one more reason this story will keep moving. The celebrity economy has changed the definition of proof. In the past, an artist could answer criticism through a magazine interview months later. Now the response has to compete with clips, captions, reaction streams, and thousands of people narrating the same moment before the artist has reached the next terminal. That speed rewards certainty even when certainty is not available. It turns a rumor into a verdict and a travel choice into a referendum. Rick Ross has benefited from that same speed many times. His social posts, one-liners, and lifestyle clips have kept his name circulating long after a record left the charts. But the system does not protect its biggest players. It tests them harder. If the next Rick Ross chapter is going to be defined by music, live performance, and business rather than by a recycled airport image, the strongest answer will not be another argument over a photograph. It will be a moment that gives the public something larger to talk about. Leave your view below. The answer may say less about one flight than it says about what the audience now demands from every star who calls himself a boss.